Thank you everybody for coming. Today we're going to have a little bit of an introduction on some science policy background, as well as a foray into local advocacy and engagement efforts. We have three speakers today. We have Dr. Adriana Bankston, who will be going first today, and then Dr. Arti Garg and Dr. Christopher Jackson, who will be our second set of speakers. And without further ado, I will go ahead and start introductions and we can get going. So Adriana Bankston is our first speaker, and she is a principal legislative analyst at the University of California, Office of Federal Government Relations in Washington, D.C., where she serves as an advocate for the university with Congress, the administration, and federal agencies. Prior to this position, Adriana was a policy and advocacy fellow at the Society for Neuroscience, where she provided staff support for special and ongoing projects, including the Society's annual lobby event and the annual meeting. In addition to working at UC, Adriana is the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Publisher of the Journal of Science, Policy, and Governance, a Fellow with Advancing Research Impact in Society, or ARIS, and a Biomedical Workforce and Policy Research Investigator at the STEM Advocacy Institute. She is also a member of the Engaging Scientists in Engineering and Policy Coalition Steering Committee, and she earned her Ph.D. in Biochemistry, Cell, and Developmental Biology from Emory University. She is on Twitter under the handle @Adriana Bankston. And without further ado, take the floor.
Thank you, Tacey, and excited to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. So I know that you all have already had a little bit of an introduction to the field, so I thought I would go into that a little, but also expanding into how science influences policy and how you can make an impact as a trainee if you're in the audience thinking about entering the field, and the kinds of things you might want to do. So before I start, as Tacey said, I am associated with the University of California, so I always have to say this is not their view, this is my personal view. And so we're going to go through sort of 4 different sections here and talk through what science policy is, how science influences policy, how things are actually made, and then again, how you can impact the field and how to succeed, which is a big statement, but a few examples and things to consider as you're thinking through this career path. So we'll start with basics, how science influences policy and what is science policy. So the book Beyond Sputnik defines science policy as a set of federal rules, regulations, and methods, practices, guidelines under which scientific research is conducted. And as you can see here, science and policy are interdependent. Science for policy is sort of one way to look at this, which we're going to talk about today, is scientific findings that are used as the basis for developing public policy. And the other side is policy for science, which is how government laws, regulations, and policies affect the practice of science. Much of my work has been in this space, sort of if you're thinking through influencing the research enterprise through policymaking, you're sort of doing the other side, but both can be going on, and you may be involved in one or the other depending on the projects you're working on. So a little history, the science of science policy, and this is a whole field, recommend this book here, co-edited by Kay Asbensfeeling. The context under which science policy was developed was, for many years, of course, that federally funded research has been known to be critical to innovation, and that policymakers should exploit opportunities to look at scientists and how we can use science to develop policymaking in an evidence-based manner. This book and other books and other resources as well talk about how we need more analytical capacity in STEM and developing a community of practice for evidence-based policy, which again has been developing over the years, but has also changed, as I'll discuss later. The goals of science policy activities in this space, if we're looking at science for policy, is developing evidentiary basis for decision making. How can we influence decision makers? How can we help them and provide them with the evidence they need? How do we create a community and connections between policymakers and researchers, which again influence each other? Other factors here, which I won't go into, relate to the economics of science policy, investments that we need to make for innovation, and so on. Again, depending on the type of policy you're working on, these are things to consider. And the recent landscape, again, has been more focused on using scientific approaches for policymakers to use evidence-based research, and how policy choices are made, again, is a whole large area that I'll go into, how scientists can get involved and how policy is actually works. So this gets to the concept of the science to policy interface, which has been studied actually, as I realized as I was preparing for this talk, for quite some time. So engagement of science with government decision-making has evolved over the last 80 years. It involves translating languages between the two communities, which is interesting that they put it that way, that there are actually two different languages to think about translating between. And how scientists have been used for advice, and of course science advice, to inform decisions made by policymakers. So a bit of history. Before World War II, science was rarely in contact with policymaking, and policymaking, again, this has evolved over time in terms of using science to inform policy. And this is known as the pursuit of common good to serve public interest. So this is, again, 80 years ago or so, and the definition of policymaking has evolved, but really remained to focus on the common good. As I already said, science advice to governments is really how it started. And for some time, it was unclear how knowledge actually enters the policymaking process. I think that's still being debated, and how to actually influence the process. And we'll go through the different factors because it's a complex ecosystem. So it really starts with Vanover Bush, who I'm sure you've heard about. So he was an American engineer. He was the first presidential advisor, which is really sort of where the practice started. And he wrote the report, Science the Endless Frontier, which was commissioned by Franklin Roosevelt, emphasizing the federal support for science, basic research, and the proposals that he wrote led to the development of the NSF in the 1950s. So interesting history. So in the book, he cites that science can be effective in national welfare only as a team, whether conditions be peace at war. Without scientific progress, no amount of achievement can really ensure health, prosperity, and security as a nation. So really this idea of the importance of science for policy and really protecting the scientific enterprise goes back to 1945 and maybe even before that. So the ways that scientists can engage, and those are things that, of course, you can think about, but again, another sort of classic book, The Honest Broker, states or sort of outlines 4 different ways to engage. So the way scientists can engage through being an issue advocate, which is synthesizing a specific agenda, you have a specific outcome in mind. The honest broker, of course, is unbiased, an unbiased view that you can use evidence to assist policymakers who then make these decisions based on the evidence provided. Science arbiter is more narrow, does not necessarily influence policy, sort of watching different areas. And again, pure scientists who don't necessarily engage with policy. So again, there's different angles here, different levels of engagement, whether or not you're trying to influence something or you're just providing information. And it's a worthwhile book to read as well. So going back to the role of science in policymaking, really, again, as it's evolved, and this is from John Kingdon, it's from 2010, the goal of good public policy is to improve society. However, science policy is a product of many inputs, mechanisms, and interactions, as I'll show you. Many entities and mechanisms are involved, which is why it's so complex and interesting too. And evolves, or sort of the second part of this, which is complicated but worthwhile thinking through, is how do you implement policies at multiple levels, and also how they're interpreted by different constituents can influence how they go or whether or not they're adopted. So John Kingdon stated that policy is complex. So you need agenda setting, developing alternatives and choices, making choices among those alternatives also is complicated. And also relationships between stakeholders and different groups is complicated as well, fluid and loosely joined. So I'll show you what that means. So how's policy actually made? So we're going to this section now. This is called the Science Policy Web, again, from Beyond Sputnik. Things to remember here, policymaking is collaborative. Those of us who have been in the field know that almost every project you work with other people on, and it ends up being sort of a group project. In many cases, it involves consensus building and collective decision making, which isn't always easy. If you're trying to especially push specific agenda or advocacy area, you need everyone to agree, or most people. Often requires limited resources and information isn't imperfect. You sort of gather what you can and make a choice. And it's also pluralistic in the sense that there's a lot of different players involved, a lot of issues, and this is sort of what this hub is about here. So at the center, you have White House offices, congressional committees, societies, universities, associations, NGOs. All of these interact with the outer thread, which is, you can see the media sort of connects all of these together. And outside, you have universities, industry, societies, government, and the public, which is sort of all around. All of these players have an interest in policy. The ones in the center constantly interact with the ones in the outer thread, so you can sort of begin to see why this is complicated. All these players have an interest in specific policies and pushing what they're interested in. And again, there's constant influx and influence from one to another and this complicated web to think about. So mechanisms that determine science policy, of course, you know, the three branches of government. And again, legislative is where laws are made, executive carries out the laws, where the president's cabinet is, and judicial, which evaluates the laws and goes back to the executive. Not to go too deeply into this again, I recommend Beyond Sputnik, which is from 2008, but still very relevant. Just again, provides a sense of the different players in the field at the presidential level, the kinds of things they're looking at, right? So the budget, how to coordinate agencies, you have the executive offices, agencies which interact again with the president and the different executive branches, Congress, which is where the laws are made, and then judiciary, which interprets the laws and so on. So again, very complicated, thinking through where sort of how things are moving, and I could give another lecture about sort of the legislative side only. But that's just something to keep in mind, is that this is a complicated machine with a lot of players. So how can you sort of think about this? So when I designed this, again, from another book, Introduction to Public Policy, steps in policymaking, if you're thinking through a specific issue, would involve identifying a social goal. So something you want to change. What is that issue? Why is it important? What is the problem you're trying to solve? Who should be acting on that? And then evaluating really the substance and politics of the policy options. Again, this goes deeply into sort of evaluating policy options against each other, which the book goes into. And then what policy you're going to essentially implement or push through. So it's a good diagram, relatively simplistic, but like I said, the book goes into all these different steps. If you're thinking through really how to design policy, is helpful to read. And also the book and also other sources going to what is actually effective policymaking, right? So again, this could be a whole other lecture, but things to look at would be the existing landscape. Is there already legislation on this? For example, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. What needs does the policy fill, and what do you want to accomplish, right? So if there's really a need and you can demonstrate that that's necessary. And again, thinking through longer term possible outcomes, advantages and disadvantages of the policy on more practical terms. This also includes policy monitoring, enforcing, managing, how much time and effort it will take, and what is the long-term impact on stakeholders, depending on who you're trying to impact? So these are all big questions. Again, I think it's a helpful framework when you're thinking through designing policies and how you want to implement something that hasn't been done and who might be impacted. So now we'll move into the third part of how you can make an impact, and I'll give you a few examples. So policymaking, as sort of up to now, I've described what it is, how to do it. It's complicated. Why would you want to get involved? It really gives you an exposure to different ways of thinking, specific topics. I think it expands your understanding of the world and problems that you can solve, and gives you an ability to really impact something that you care about. Strategically, you want to think about how you can impact your policy idea. And again, what is sort of the bigger picture of your idea? Where does it fit into the ecosystem that we talked about? And how does that impact the community and the public, for example? And of course, you can engage other stakeholders, which are in the policy web that I showed you. But I think it's a way to impact something that you're interested in, that society cares about, and you have a passion for. And I'll show you a couple of examples. I always like to show these slides about sort of where do I even look at science policy opportunities. Students always ask these questions. So of course, I work for a university. There are many other places you can do this. Just a few settings here. Think tank, universities, societies, nonprofits, of course, government and funding agencies, and of course, Capitol Hill. So depending on where you are, the different kinds of jobs you can look at. Again, a common question that I get, what kind of jobs are these? What should I be looking for? It sort of ranges, at least in my mind, sort of from more research and report-based, you're sort of behind the scenes developing things that advocates will push, for example, and you may or may not be doing advocacy. You can be sort of more on the communication side. You can do programs. So programs versus policies, that's something else. Program analyst versus a policy advisor, for example. And then you can be sort of lobbying and working on the Hill too. So a range of options here. The different kinds of titles can be confusing, but I thought it'd be helpful to show this too. So those are sort of the basics. Now, what are the kinds of things you can do? And I'll show you a couple of things that I've been involved in as well. So one thing is what you want to develop. Again, as I said, this is sort of how to succeed, but it's really things to prepare you for this career path. Things you can think through and develop. So one thing is that you already have a lot of skills you can apply to policy. If you're a scientist, you have subject matter expertise, you understand how science works, you can analyze data, think critically, and manage projects, which are really things that all of us who are in policy do on a daily basis. It's just a different sort of project than it is when you're doing lab research. What is maybe not so common, or you may not think about, how do you talk to non-scientists? So taking opportunities to do this in the community is helpful. In terms of sort of policy development, there is kind of a science of looking at the audience, developing consensus, which I already talked about, and how you're actually pushing a specific policy. That sort of comes with practice too. And then the last part is developing skills and networking and professional relationships. Really goes a long way when you're setting out and developing your path as well. Another question I get a lot is, how do I even know about what is out there? What kind of things should I read? So ways to gain knowledge would be policy groups at your university, writing op-eds and blog posts and reading sort of what's happening today. Talking to professionals who are in the field, and also researching your local representative is helpful. And then looking at what's on social media. Again, Twitter is a great place to do that and connect with folks, and applying for fellowships and internships and so on, which we can discuss as well. One thing that I found, and this is something that, again, I give advice to students about, how do I stand out? I think science policy is becoming more crowded. A lot of people are interested in it. It's harder to kind of create a path for yourself. And so this is I think has worked for me as well, is finding something that you're really passionate about and then let people know that, blog about it, get on a podcast and talk about it, meet with people, talk to people and let them know what your interests are. Things people will sort of start to get to know you for specific areas as you have different activities. And finding ways to gain experience in that, again, through different societies or nonprofits or groups that you're locally involved with, and showing really your commitment and really excitement for the topic can go a long way if you're trying to create a niche in a specific policy area. So I want to show you just two examples of what I've been able to do in my job. Again, not representing UC here, but I think these are good things to think about if you're thinking about a job like this and the kinds of things you might be doing in a policy job. So one is we organize a lot of events with, in this case, trainees to talk about impacts of COVID on early career researchers and the research enterprise. These events are helpful for Hill staff to listen to what you have to say and what they're going through. They can sort of take that into account when they're thinking through future legislation. Another option of sort of impacting the field is through responding to RFIs. This is just one of the RFIs I worked on a couple of years ago related to the STEM workforce diversity. This was a response from AAU that was submitted to NSF. Again, this is a good way to get started and sort of get your views out there into sort of a larger community response like this, and writing a piece for an RFI is a good way to start. Another option, and this is something, again, I could talk about for a long time because I do more of this now, sort of writing legislative language in my day job, but writing a language for a bill is, again, helpful. We wrote the section for what was the NSF for the Future Act, which was turned into CHIPS, which was signed into law, but essentially including postdocs into professional development funding in the bill. And that's exciting to really see the sort of contribution move forward and go all the way to, President Biden signing the bill this August. So this is another something that you can get involved in and work on if you're working with an organization that does this sort of thing and impact legislation that way. That's pretty exciting. So in the last few minutes, because just wanted to touch a little bit upon the journal that I run, and this is mainly because I realized that my job, probably about 80% of what I do is write. So I think it's really important to emphasize as trainees to think about working on your writing skills when you're in grad school, about how to actually write a paper in policy, and that can go a long way. So just spend a couple of minutes talking about the journal and what we do, and hopefully pique your interest as well. So we are an internationally recognized open access and peer-reviewed journal. We publish a variety of formats, as you can see here, memos and op-eds, analyses, and so on. We also seek to bolster credentials in research and writing for early career scholars. We promote the work through our mailing list and so on. And try to provide opportunities for authors to talk about published work as well. So really it is a professional development opportunity as well. Here are just all the different areas we publish on. I won't go into this, but I encourage you to check it out. It's quite broad on purpose, so we can publish on a number of topics. And currently have 2 call for submissions open. One is on global chain science with the IAI, which is in South America. And it covers issues related to sort of expanding to that area, what specific challenges they have. And I think it should be a broadly interesting discussion. We'll have a couple of events coming up later this month in December too. And then we have another call, which is relevant. to the election for our standard issue with the National Science Policy Network, which closes on November 6th. So sort of geared towards general policy topics, but around the election, what young people think legislators should do. And so we'll see sort of where that goes, but there's still time to include your submissions in that as well. So that's it for me. Here's my contact, LinkedIn, Twitter. Again, feel free to connect and follow me, and I'm happy to stick around and chat more afterwards as well, if you'd like. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Bankston. I think that was a really great introduction. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask, Adriana, Bankston, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we can read them out for you, or you can raise your hand and we'll allow you to unmute. I guess I'll just ask maybe some few random questions to get us started, and if nobody else chimes in, then we can move on, or you can talk about something else if there's something you think would be kind of a cool tidbit to add. I guess one basic question I feel like that a lot of graduate students, especially if they're interested in science policy or moving into science policy, right, we're not really as maybe aware of some of the challenges you might face. So what would you say, coming from a PhD background, was something that you found really hard to transition into science policy, or something you weren't expecting to be as challenging as it was?
Yeah, one thing I always say is, you know, you're really going from being an expert in your research area to being a generalist and having to cover a lot of different issues in a quick time frame. So, and also I think a lot of these issues, you don't really get very in depth into, you know, issues as you would as a scientist, where you sort of spend 5 years on something, right? This is like, I'm dealing with 20 different topics, kind of scratching the surface on here's this or the other thing. My boss needs this, you know, letter, this email by the end of the week, and so on. So some of it can seem a little random sometimes, and also you just, you know, don't expect to necessarily do deep research into things, right? It's going to be a little bit of like, your boss will say like, I need this and that quickly. That's the other thing is, it's quite fast paced, you know, so you kind of learn how things go, because I remember when I started, I sort of panicked and thought like, oh, everything is due tomorrow. And then, you know, he would say, no, like this, you can do this by next week. And so learning when things, I mean, being in the field for a while, you kind of get a feel for what's urgent. But when you start out, it's sort of like, you know, you want to do well and you just think everything has to be done now. So just pace yourself and, you know, ask questions from people that are, you know, in your team, because they've all been through it and they were all started at some point.
That's some really good advice. On the flip side of that, is there something that you feel like you enjoy a lot more about the maybe science policy atmosphere as opposed to research? I mean, that kind of maybe hand in hand, but.
Yeah, I think I found that it suits my personality very well, in that I'm sort of, you know, you're always learning something new, kind of exposed to a new area, even though, you know, we work on research policy, and that's really anything and everything that UC system works on, which is a lot of things. But I do like the variety of tasks. You know, different projects will require different skills. I like that it's quicker in a way, that some projects will be like, you know, draft this letter, which sometimes can go through approvals and can take a while, but for the most part, it's much faster to feel like at the end of the week, I've accomplished, you know, these 3 things, and not like I'm still doing experiments. I feel like, you know, you get a little bit of gratification at the end of the week, like, oh, at least it's something I can put it down, you know, this is completed, right? That's exciting. Yeah.
Most of us can agree with that kind of statement. We do have one question, and it's not actually from a graduate student. This is from one of the undergraduates who's attending our webinar here. And she's just asking if you're looking at it, maybe both, I guess, from an early graduate student perspective, as well as maybe undergraduates or some of the more or less technical master's degrees, what's a good way to sort of try to get into this field or learn about this field if you don't have the opportunity to like connect or network or take a class or something on this? And maybe this question might be for Arti and Chris as well later.
Yeah, I think So kind of two things, and the way that I've navigated the transition is try to find a local policy group that's involved in this. If you have it at your university, a lot of people that didn't have it started their own group, and that's also helpful. So try to find some local engagement. I think there's always, societies and nonprofits that are engaged in specific topics that you can volunteer with. And also look at national organizations, right? So my transition sort of has been through, and I didn't go into this, but the kind of reforms in research and scientific enterprise, and there are a lot of groups that work on this and want to help sort of the system improve, right? So I think that's what I would recommend, is looking at local and national groups working on an issue that you're interested in. Talk to people like me who are, transitioned and do this. I think internships are a good way if that's an opportunity. I know some universities offer this, and we actually have that in our office too. So that may be an opportunity for undergraduates too, because I think there's some undergrad internships to look at.
Awesome. I think that sounds great. I think it's a great answer. I don't have any other specific questions unless anybody else in the audience has any questions they'd like to ask before we switch topics. And that was kind of a nice segue into switching some of these topics, because that'll be maybe some of the focus of our next set of speech components. I don't see anything coming in the chat. Maybe wait another like 10 seconds, 20 seconds if anyone can type real quickly. Otherwise, we might switch gears a little bit here.
And I'll stay through the talk, so if anything else comes up, you can ask after too. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yes. All right, I don't see anything else coming in, so we're going to go ahead and keep moving and switch if Arti and Chris, you guys are ready to start. Awesome. So we have two speakers for this next section who work together, and I will introduce both of them, and then they'll give you a little bit of background and some information on some engagement and what they do, and some examples of maybe how you might get involved. So Dr. Arti Garg is the founder and chair of Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally, which is a national organization dedicated to increasing city, county, and state level engagement by people with backgrounds in STEM. She's also an AI technology executive and currently serves on the Community Services Commission in the city of Hayward, California. In the past, she has held roles in the White House Office of Management and Budget and as a legislative fellow in Congress. Dr. Garg has a Ph.D. in physics and a master's in aerospace engineering. And our second speaker is Dr. Christopher Jackson, who is the workshops director and steering committee member for Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally. He currently works in public policy, supporting international aid and technical assistance programs related to power sector and critical minerals governance. He has previously held leadership roles with the National Science Policy Network, the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, which we just heard a little bit about, and the Science Policy Group at Berkeley. He holds a PhD in chemistry from UC Berkeley. And with that, I will let the two of you take it away.
Thanks so much, Tacey. Chris. All right. Well, so today, actually, we're going to focus, Chris and I are going to focus a little bit more specifically on kind of engagement and advocacy with a local lens to it, and even, particularly highlighting some fairly impactful things that graduate students have done and opportunities that you can take advantage of as a student as well. Chris, do you want to jump to the next slide? So, thanks for a great introduction, Tacey. Today, our discussion is going to be led by myself and by Chris. I think that both of us have worked across both federal and kind of in state and local engagement efforts. And so we're going to try to provide you a little bit more focus on the state and local side of things, because I think that's an area that sometimes gets underappreciated with respect to science policy, because there's often a lot of focus on, as Adriana sort of talked about, policy for science. But when you start to really open the lens into science for policy, I think that there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of need for technical expertise at the kind of more local and community level. And this is something that Chris and I spend a lot of our time thinking about. And so just jumping to the next slide, and this is why, because I think, sort of a truism around any sort of policy engagement, and really when you think about policy engagement from the perspective of really trying to influence decisions, decisions get made by those who show up. This is something that if you've ever heard me speak anywhere, you've heard me start pretty much every talk I ever give for engineers and scientists acting locally with the statement, because it's really true. And it cuts across, I would say, all forms of policy engagement, not just local policy engagement, but I think it's a reason to sort of really think rather than looking, I live in California, y'all are in Texas, rather kind of looking sort of across the country to Washington, D.C. In terms of where you can have an impact, look kind of toward your city hall or maybe your state capitol, toward where you can have an impact. Because when I say show up, I don't mean show up once. I mean show up over and over again every time there's the topic that you care about comes up, or show up just to let people know that you care. And that's a lot easier to do if you're talking about showing up with in your local community. And it's also a lot easier to sort of get known and form relationships with local leaders and decision makers. And so if you remember nothing else from what Chris and I have to say after this, just remember this, is that if you really want to influence decisions, the most important thing is not what skills, not sort of knowing all these nuts and bolts that we're going to talk to you about, but just knowing that you should show up in order to make a difference. So Chris, can you jump to the next slide? I've talked a little bit about local government, and, Chris and I are coming from engineers and scientists acting locally, but, what does that mean and what can it encompass? And so for us, locally is really anything that's not federal, and it kind of can take a lot of different shapes and formats. So state governments, I think, sort of like this map is the state of California, you'll learn the state of Texas, these are big states. And so state governments actually have a lot of influence and receive a fair amount of attention across the country, but that still doesn't mean that it's not accessible to students, to people who are sort of early in their careers. Chris will talk a little bit about, I think, some engagement work he's done in the state of California. We've featured work from graduate students who have engaged with state legislatures in Texas. So I don't want to dissuade you, even though you're in a bigger state, from thinking about opportunities to really kind of engage at the state level. And what the slide also shows is that sort of at every level of government, there are a lot of different avenues for engaging, whether it be governor's offices, which can sometimes have a lot of highly specialized programs, state legislatures, various departments and agencies. State governments often form advisory boards and commissions, and sometimes they also form technical working groups. We have an example on ESAL's website of somebody who worked with a fairly technical working group in the state of Alaska on water quality. And, specifically some of the people asked to join were people who had backgrounds in environmental chemistry and water and other areas that impact water quality. Beyond your state government, another entity to think about are your county governments. Once again, county governments have a lot of different avenues for engagement, and there's a few areas that county governments tend to be responsible for that really do intersect with questions of science and technology, be they public health commissions. Probably a lot of us became a lot more familiar with public health commissions in the last couple of years. Election commissions, which currently are often making a lot of decisions around technology choices. And then again, county governments often form sort of citizen advisory boards and commissions. And there can be a lot of different, often you don't need specialized expertise to serve on one of these boards or commissions. And then moving to smaller levels of government, city governments, again, maybe these are in some ways more familiar to people than county governments. Once again, you've got a lot of different tiers. You've got a mayor, you've got a city council, which is sort of your legislative entity. You've got departments and agencies. One of the things that's kind of unusual in city governments is in city governments, departments and agencies often don't report to elected officials. State government departments and agencies usually report to the elected governor. In city governments, they usually report to an appointed city manager. That city manager is appointed by elected officials, but the elected officials don't often oversee the work of the city. And that little nuance can be valuable if you're looking to engage in your city to just sort of remember who actually oversees the work there. And then sort of like I am a city commissioner, cities often have lots of advisory boards and commissions. Sometimes you'll see that they have standing vacancies. And, you know, the one thing that I will say is if you're interested in joining a board or commission, don't be too picky. Often showing up for the first board or commission can be a way to get appointed to other ones. Beyond your city, there's other sort of entities that maybe are city sized, whether they be school districts, parks and recreation districts, utility districts, and water boards. Most of these have some elected officials associated with them. And also most of these deal with a lot of STEM related issues. And then finally, when talking to students, especially, we think about other forms of governance that you could engage with. And if you live in a neighborhood, maybe there's some kind of neighborhood commission. Often communities form response teams to, say, disasters, and that can be a great way to just kind of learn operationally what's happening. And then, of course, your university has its own governance structure, and I served as an undergrad in university governance and as a grad student, and that's a great way to learn some of the nuts and bolts of engaging on kind of decisions and policy discussions. So there's a lot of information in one slide, and I think we will be sharing the slides with you, but this is just a way to kind of orient yourself to what, where you can potentially engage in local government. There's a little link to a digital roadmap that we have available on our website that also can help you navigate the websites of your local governments when looking for some of these places where you might want to engage. So Chris, can you jump to the next slide? So I talked a lot about kind of where in the structure of local government you might want to engage. What are the topics that local governments deal with that have some kind of STEM angle to it? So if you thought the last slide was an eye chart, this is definitely an eye chart, and I'm not going to sit here and walk through all of it. But the purpose of this slide is really just to point out that there's pretty much no issue that doesn't have a STEM angle to it. And there's also pretty much no issue where local government doesn't have some kind of role to play. And so, I always start with climate, partially because it's the first one on the slide, but also because often we think of climate as being a very international issue. And, the conversation in the news and the media is often framed around kind of national policy. And of course, international policy and national policy are important to climate, but there's a lot of critical things that local governments can do. Things from local governments need to have climate action plans because that's often the last mile of implementing climate mitigation solutions, decarbonization solutions. Green building codes are an important part of both climate resilience and also climate mitigation from the standpoint of potentially reducing the use of fossil fuels. Disaster resilience is really important, increasingly important. There's really no city, there's no community in the country that's completely protected from climate impacts as sort of our weather and climate becomes more unpredictable. And then of course, renewable energy adoption is something that's very much driven by state policy. And I think in Texas, that's really the largest driver of kind of how renewable energy gets linked into your kind of ERCOT system. In other places, there can be sort of more community level incentives as well. And maybe there are some programs in Texas around, say, like rooftop solar. So, just picking one issue and sort of pointing out all the different ways that if this is an issue you care about, you can engage at the local level and you might find you have a much larger impact on these issues than you expected. So with that, Chris, can you jump to the next slide? So, I'm saying all this stuff and I showed you all these abstract slides with a lot of words and a lot of green. And that may still feel a little bit intimidating though, in terms of how you can actually really, as a student, maybe getting started for the first time, make a difference. So, we want to share the story of actually to at the time that they engaged in this activity, Ph.D. candidates at Rice University, Catherine Kundrad and Mary Natoli. And so the story of Catherine and Mary is that they are avid cyclists and they liked cycling to and from campus, around campus. And unfortunately, though, there were a number of safety issues with respect to sort of cycling safety near the campus, including 2 deaths. And so they decided they wanted to do something about this because they felt that it was important to make the community close to where Rice's campus was safer for cyclists. So what did they do? Chris, they started attending city council meetings and just sort of listening to the discourse that was happening around cycling safety. And then what they also did was actually start collecting data, signal times, crosswalk visibility, just sort of like collecting some information around what the current status quo was around bicycle safety. And then they started using public comments to present those data and kind of not just say, hey, there's a problem with cycling safety, but really provide some quantitative metrics to back up that claim. And so what that ultimately led to was, you want to click on the last one, Chris? A number of policy changes became implemented within the city, within the city of Houston, near where Rice University was, that led to sort of real changes that make a real difference in terms of bike safety. And you can actually see here the students who were involved, standing alongside a city council member who helped champion some of these policy changes. So, from my perspective, that's real impactful change that actually has both a public safety component to it and also a climate change component to it. But that's really the type of thing that you can achieve through local advocacy and really just picking something that you care about and then using the thought processes that you have and some of the skills that you have as scientists and engineers to collect data and present information in a consumable way. I'll point out that Catherine and Mary were both in the bioengineering program, not say in a transportation program. Nonetheless, they were able to have a pretty concrete impact on transportation policy by just sort of leveraging these broader skills that you have as scientists and engineers. And so with that, I just want to, this is a great story and, hopefully this makes you feel a little bit more inspired about what you can do, but it may still be a little intimidating to think about this idea of giving public comments and speaking publicly in front of city council. And so we wanted to share a little bit about how to approach that in kind of a more step-by-step way. So we have some information available on our website that provides kind of these guides to different ways that you can engage with your local governments, local communities. One of them are delivering public comments at sort of oral public comments at meetings. And why should you do this? One is it's a way for you to provide input for a policy that's already under consideration, or it can be a way to bring a new issue or policy idea to your government's attention so that it could be agendized at a later meeting, for example. And what can be the outcome? Well, an ideal outcome is that whatever your views are, as in the case of Mary and Catherine, they get incorporated into the policy process. Maybe it doesn't quite, get that far, but you end up at least forming some relationship with government officials who keep you informed of sort of future developments on things that you care about. And maybe you learn something about the background of a policy area that you didn't quite know about. And so, that's all well and good. How do you get there? So, the next slide. So we try to break this down into a few easy steps. So first is just find what the appropriate body is for your comments. Go to your government's website, look at the charters and past agendas of various bodies. It might be that your city council, which usually you'll find kind of the broadest set of comments being made at like a council meeting, is the appropriate venue, but it could be that there's a council committee or even like a sort of citizens advisory committee, like one that I serve on, that would have more ability to understand the details of what you're bringing up and more authority to sort of take it up and move it to the next step. So it's very useful to think about where you're delivering these comments. Next bullet. So, and then once you kind of figure out where you want to deliver it, figure out when to deliver it, you know, see if there's, see if the topic is coming up or a related topic is coming up where you should deliver your comments. Alternatively, if there's some very controversial topic coming up, you might want to wait and not deliver your comments at that specific meeting because it will kind of get lost in some other set of discussion. And then, you know, we highly recommend, if you can jump to the next number, to draft your talking points or even full remarks beforehand. And the goal here is to be concise. You often only get like 2 minutes, and you know, often there's a sort of time restriction. It really depends on whoever's chairing the body, but usually 2 minutes is a pretty common time frame that you'd be given for public comment. Try to be prescriptive. Say, we should adopt XYZ policy, or, you know, you should look at this specific thing, because that can be, even if it's not the full scope of what needs to be done, it can at least provide sort of a leverage point for moving the issue forward. And then finally, and this is really important, explain why this issue matters to you personally. Ultimately, we live in a democracy, and so the interest of any of our elected officials is to sort of really serve their constituents and voters. And it can feel like maybe presenting a ton of data and a ton of sort of objective information is the right thing to do, but it's actually not what's going to resonate and move a decision maker, especially a decision maker who maybe isn't already planning to do what you're asking them to do. So explain why, as a member of your community, you care about this issue. Ultimately, going back to Catherine and Mary, they were avid cyclists. Bike safety matters to them personally because it affects their safety and it affects their quality of life. And I think that's really important, especially from an advocacy perspective, to really ensure that you're not just communicating the facts, but also communicating why someone should care about those facts. Can you jump to the next slide, Chris? So, you know, we've recommended that you draft out your comments or at least some talking points beforehand. Bring a printed copy of those to the meeting, because you might be asked to give them to whoever's chairing the meeting or some staff who are present. And they may want to read it in more detail, follow up on it. So it's always a good idea to bring a printed copy. Just from a logistics standpoint, try to arrive on time and try to stay for the duration. The reason for this is kind of twofold. Sometimes public comments are often at the very beginning, so you want to arrive on time or a little bit early to make sure that you're able to deliver them. Other times, however, public comments may end up being requested for each agenda item. And so you might want to wait until the public comment period right before the agenda item that you care about is being discussed. And I will say, attending any kind of public meeting can often be very educational, even for the topics that you didn't decide to attend for. So I highly recommend it, just from the perspective of learning more about what's happening in your community. And then finally, when you deliver comments, always be respectful and polite. Thank the chair, thank whatever body you're speaking to for taking the time to listen. And because ultimately, you kind of catch more flies with sugar than you do with vinegar. And it's kind of the same thing here. You're really working to persuade decision makers. And so the more you can build common cause with them, the more likely you are to sort of really move the needle forward on whatever area you're trying to kind of make a change on. And the other thing is make sure that you recognize you're speaking to a pretty broad audience. So make sure you're using comments that are accessible and kind of don't assume a lot of prior knowledge. And then finally, and I alluded to this a little bit when talking about personalizing your comments, remember that science is only one input into any decision. And so the more you can kind of contextualize why maybe the science or data that you bring to bear matters to a broader set of conversations, and then also sharing why you care about this outside of your kind of scientist or engineer hat, I think the more likely you are to sort of build that relationship with decision makers in your community. And with that, I think Chris is going to jump a little bit more on that sort of relationship aspect of local policy engagement. And so I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thanks, Arti. Yep, exactly where I want to kind of pick up that thread on specifically developing those relationships. I think one of the key things from Catherine and Mary's story in particular, right, was that if you kind of read the blog, you might post this on ESOL's website, you might pick up on, they, in addition to kind of doing this one thing, that kind of one act got them more involved in kind of their local community and in transportation safety more broadly and biking safety more broadly in the city of Houston. So I think a great way, we talk a lot about kind of these different mechanisms like delivering public comments as one way to get your foot in the door and start thinking about local engagement and local advocacy. But we talk to a lot of different people. We interview a lot of folks that you can read about on the ESOL blog. And for many of them, right, it starts with this one thing and then it kind of goes from there and they get more and more involved. So we really encourage you to kind of take that first step, no matter what it is, whether it's public comments, whether it's kind of just going to a city council meeting or go visiting your state legislature or whatever that might be. All of these things that have in common really policy making at all levels of government, but particularly at the local level, we believe is really about building those relationships. It's not about necessarily about getting any one decision or any one policy implemented, or kind of lending your expertise or scientific background to one issue. It's more about building that trust, and that trust that comes with knowing people who live near you, who work in your community, and engaging with them regularly. So whether that's through public comments, whether it's just community events to meet different community members, or just getting coffee with the representative. I think one thing that Arti highlighted really early on, right, when you're thinking about local policymakers, they can be much more accessible than saying having to schedule a formal trip and fly out to DC. They are people who live near you in your community and are generally much more willing, and it's their job, right, to represent constituents, and so they want to be a part of that and have you be a part of that experience, or even serving on an advisory body if you kind of, again, get more and more involved in some of these opportunities. I just want to flag this quote that's up here. It's by Louis Abramson. He's an astrophysicist based near Caltech. And when we interviewed him, he serves on the Central Hollywood Neighborhood Council. When we talked to him, he was addressing a lot of his work addresses homelessness and those types of issues. But more broadly, one of the things he said, right, all of you here on this call today have some issue that you care about. Whether it's related to your scientific expertise or whether it's just something like Catherine and Mary, or it was cycling and traffic safety, there's something that you care about. And so when there is somebody in your local community that is addressing that issue. So
Looks like.
Yeah, looks like.
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm
I was
not
gonna-
sure what happened there.
It's all good. Technology is
Okay.
sometimes creepy.
All right. So as I was saying, there's some issue that you care about in your community, and so we encourage you to find that meeting, whether it's a city council meeting, whether it's some commission meeting, some neighborhood council. Go to that meeting, and you go once and you continue to engage. You go a second time. Again, these communities are small, and there's typically not as many folks engaging on these issues. So at the second meeting, someone might recognize you. The third time, they know your name. The fourth time, you're already in charge of something. So it's just a great opportunity for you as a scientist and engineer to get more involved in your local community and really have a tangible impact, I believe much more effectively than you might otherwise. And so I'm a recent graduate of a PhD program. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how some ways that I got involved locally and tackled some of these local issues, again, making it a little bit more concrete when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. And so, as I mentioned, identifying that local policy issue that you care about. For me, one of the things that I was particularly passionate about was electric vehicles and electric vehicle access, access to kind of these both financial saving as well as a lot of health benefits, particularly around low-income communities in California, in my home state at the time. And so a couple different ways that I thought about this, and this can be hopefully serve as a framework for how you might think about any particular local policy issue that you're really passionate about. So, as I mentioned, how do you identify these local issues and find the way that you can get engaged? As Arti mentioned, right, when one of the first steps in our Delivering Public Comments playbook, more broadly about local engagement, think about the relevant local bodies in your community and review their past agendas, review their past meeting notes, see where the discussion is already taking place in your community. You never want to, completely reinvent the wheel. So you want to kind of understand where any particular policy or process is at, and kind of go from there. In my research, kind of doing electric vehicle work, in California, this is primarily governed by at the state level, the California Air Resources Board, and at the city level by any particular city energy commission. And so kind of, again, digging into like the city of Berkeley's energy commissions, I attended some meetings, looked at some of their action items for 2021 at the time. And right, they have a variety of different, you can read through it, and if you get really into the weeds, you can find, right, they have a specific recommendations that they are looking at for fleet electrification. So again, that's a great place where, you get engaged and find out what's exactly is happening in your local community. Part of this is thinking about what are the existing or even just proposed policies already related to this issue, right? So in California, there's an executive order by the governor for 5 million zero-emission vehicles by 2030 and X number of EV charging stations by 2025, right? So that's kind of understanding now, looking a bit more broadly at the state level. Okay, what are the top level mandates that we're trying to match and that we need to kind of be considerate of and aware of, that will be applying pressure kind of at the more local level to drive policy. That, as well as kind of a variety of different pieces of legislation that had been introduced over the course of 10, 15 years at the state level. So to understand, again, the history of an issue and kind of how an issue is progressing and how you might be able to influence that decision. I think Adriana's talk gave some great examples of getting really in the weeds of how you can specifically influence different pieces of legislation and even kind of very detailed changes in legislative text that can have a really big impact. And finally, identifying the allies kind of in your community, whether policymakers or other kind of folks whose interests align with yours. So as kind of see, right, in the previous little box, folks who had introduced legislation previously about electric vehicles, and specifically electric vehicles equity and adoption more broadly. One of the folks who was working on this really actively at the time in the California State Legislature was Phil Ting, who served on the Assembly Committee on Utilities and Energy. Similarly, right, looking at legislation that had been previously introduced, for example, on a study for future EV charging needs, as well as kind of different legislation to speed up EV charger installations. So by understanding kind of, right, this is how a local policy issue is, one, being addressed, right? This is a big issue. It's being addressed by many different players, even just at the local level, not even taking into account, federal policy. And so how can you insert yourself and kind of add value to any particular piece of that puzzle, I think is really important. So I think this is, once you have kind of identified at a high level, right, what policy issue you're really passionate about or that you want to drive, I think really diving into this a little bit more is a great way to then determine how you want to have impact. And ESAL has another playbook on our website specifically to help walk you through these steps a little bit. Next, I just want to chat a little bit about the many different forms that local policy can take. On one of those first slides that Arti shared, she talked a little bit about how universities can be their own form of local advocacy, and recognizing that many of folks here might be affiliated with universities. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I did as a graduate student, again, that have a very distinct local policy angle. One was local voter information nights as part of the science policy group at Berkeley's STEM Votes initiative. Elections, I'm sure, are on everyone's mind. I just filled out my ballot for California recently. And so in California, we vote on propositions that can be very esoteric, don't always make the most sense. And so one of the things that our group was particularly interested in was kind of demystifying this process, right? As scientists and engineers, we're used to taking technical things that don't make a lot of sense and trying to distill them into, make sense of them. So that's one of the things we did, particularly on ballot initiatives in California, and kind of using this kind of by providing information, increasing voter turnout, and getting folks, really thinking about, what are the issues that are affecting the state level, also county measures as well. Another thing that Arti previously mentioned was thinking about universities as a forum. I served on the UC Berkeley Asian American Pacific Islander Standing Committee for 2 years during graduate school. And I'd say, kind of as someone who works in public policy now, this was one of the most influential, or one of the best learning opportunities, I think, for how to actually influence public policy, of the many things I did, even though it was not STEM related at all. But thinking about how you can build coalitions and really develop and influence policymakers or more senior folks working. I think working in university is a great way to learn how to navigate a bureaucracy that exists at probably every level of government, and kind of how to frame your recommendations and make concrete change through those existing pipelines is a really valuable skill. This is just an example of one of the reports that I was part of authoring, and kind of helping frame that, and then kind of not only write a report, but then socialize it among relevant stakeholders and kind of get them to act on it. And finally, thinking at the kind of broadest at the state level, again, one of the things that our group, the Science Policy Group at Berkeley, did was visit California state legislative offices to advocate on particular science policy issues, and more broadly, just kind of developing those relationships with the policymakers there to become more trusted sources of kind of information, particularly on STEM issues. And so I think there is a playbook on ESAL's website. It's particularly about visiting with your state legislative offices. But I think this is a great kind of experience and opportunity for you to, again, influence policy. Texas and California are both really big states that have a lot of different policies that are being implemented and considered. And so this is a great opportunity for folks like you to engage on kind of a very wide variety of issues and have an impact. And so as you're thinking about, ways you would like to engage, inevitably it comes down to, you'll probably at some point be communicating with policymakers and talking to folks who, again, most likely will not have kind of a STEM background. They almost definitely will not have your level of expertise in any particular issue, but it's important to think about how you're communicating with them. And we just want to break it down into a couple key steps here. A couple key questions you might consider as you're thinking about, framing your message when you're going to a city council meeting, you're going to meet with a state legislator. How should you frame your message to have the most impact? And so it always starts out with kind of, what do they care about, right? I showed kind of in those charts, there identify policymakers who serve on XYZ committee, or who have a pet issue. Maybe their pet issue is affordable housing. Maybe their pet issue is electric vehicles. Kind of knowing what they care about helps you situate kind of provides a frame of reference for your particular story or advocacy, and helps make it that much more effective. The second piece of this, right, is not only what do they care about, but what relevant expertise do you bring to the table? And I use expertise here in a really broad context. It might be your scientific training and that level of expertise, but it might also be kind of your lived experience. For example, in Catherine and Mary's case, right? Their expertise wasn't necessarily in bioengineering, but their expertise was in being, cyclists in that community who happen to have, maybe some data experience, but more importantly, that lived experience is kind of, in that case, relevant expertise. And finally, what hats are you wearing? I think this is something that we talk about a lot about at ESOL when you're thinking about local engagement. Sometimes that scientist hat is the right one to be wearing, right? Sometimes that can give you a lot of influence and have folks listen to you. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're not necessarily communicating as a scientist, but maybe you're coming as a student, which is has its own kind of power and influence and kind of perspective that is really important to have in these policy discussions. Maybe you're coming as someone who comes from a immigrant family or something. There's a lot of backgrounds and perspectives that you can bring to any discussion that I think is important to recognize when you're communicating any message. And finally, right, recognizing that not every issue is cut and dry, and policymakers are not always going to be as receptive or maybe agree as much with you on different issues. Politics can be challenging, but all politics are local, right? And all politics are personal. Every elected representative or policymaker in your community is doing it for a reason, and hopefully it's your job to kind of help show them how any particular issue that you're advocating for, any particular issue you want to address, kind of fits into that perspective and help, again, telling your story and how an issue is personally impactful to you can go a long way. And so at ESOL, we recognize that some of these, we provide you with these guides and we provide you with these resources, and we recognize that sometimes it's just hard to know where to start still. And that kind of you have all these ideas and you have all these opportunities, but you're not sure what to do. So one of the things we do on our blog is really feature stories of scientists and engineers like Catherine and Mary that you saw, who are engaging in their community and helping to help provide kind of that concrete foothold for you to get started. Not everything has to be as in-depth as what Catherine and Mary did, right? So one of the things that we do on the ESOL blog is postcards. These can be simple, a couple bullet points or a couple sentences about taking that first step towards local engagement, because we really think that that first step is the key that we want. I think I'm back.
You're back. We can see you.
Sorry about that. Understanding what issues are in their community, and so that we want more scientists and engineers to understand the issues in their community and really just get started at any level. And so our postcards are a great way for you to share what we hope that you'll do after this workshop. And so this is just a brief example of Leah Karen. She's works in federal science policy in DC, but what she was particularly interested in was getting involved around the elections. And this was in 2020, 2 years ago now. And so she volunteered as a member of a ballot curing team in North Carolina, which is basically kind of helping voters whose mail-in ballots are rejected, calling them, telling them the necessary changes to get an issue fixed. So she did that. How did she do this? Right, very simple. This was again during the height of the pandemic, but joined a couple of Zoom calls to get trained, and then she called voters. They provided her with all the resources that she needed to do, and then she was able to do that, from the comfort of her home. Relatively low effort, but very high impact. As you can kind of see from that outcome, more than 15,000 ballots were cured across just the state of North Carolina, and probably more than that. And then she went out to volunteer for similar efforts again. So taking that first step in local engagement, whether it's engaging around an election like this or any other particular, attending a city council meeting, can be as simple as that, can really lead to a lot more opportunities in the future. And so ESOL is here to help you take that first step and get engaged. I mentioned our articles on our website where we feature both individuals and organizations that are engaging in local policies. You can check it out and I'm sure there's someone or an organization that aligns with your interests, and so you can read about what they're doing and hopefully be inspired to take action yourself. We host events, we do workshops and issue-focused panels. We're at a lot of scientific conferences. We're just at SACNAS. We'll be at AGU in December. So if you're interested in kind of getting more involved or hearing more about ESAL or asking us to do a workshop for you, please get in touch. We're happy to do that. And we also have a lot of resources. We've talked about the local engagement playbook on our website, but we also have kind of a local STEM database, a civics 101 if you're just looking for more background on what civics looks like at the local level, and a lot more issue-focused content. Finally, there's a lot of pathways to impact, right? We've talked about a couple of public comments today, but there are really a whole myriad of different ways that you can get involved, whether that's through advocacy, meeting with folks in your community, whether it's through more long-term service. You could serve on a local city commission or even run for office. We have stories about engineers and scientists who have done that. And you can also offer your expert guidance as a scientist and engineer, again, kind of through some of those more technical public comments, or maybe in a state hearing, or serving on a working group, as Arti talked about kind of at the beginning. So again, this is really to demonstrate there's a whole wide variety of pathways to impact in your local community. And so we hope you'll kind of take advantage of them, and ESAL has resources to help you do so. So please take advantage of those as well. Also, ESAL is entirely volunteer run. So if you're interested in getting involved with ESAL, please visit our website. We have a variety of openings right now, so we'd love to have you be part of the team. We have folks from a wide variety of different career stages who are all just passionate about getting folks involved in local civic engagement. So we hope you'll join us. If you're interested, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And with that, thank you for having us. I'm happy to answer further questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris and Arti. I really enjoyed that. I think it was really interesting to hear because I've heard a lot about your program in general, so it's nice to get a chance to sort of put some faces to the names and hear a little bit about it. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'll just go ahead and sort of fire off some questions for both of you. And Adriana, if you want to jump in at any point too and add some information, feel free. We're kind of reaching sort of the last 15 or so minutes. I guess maybe, Chris, since you had talked about a little bit about working in as a graduate student, some of these engagement levels, we've talked a lot about how, right, having the scientific expertise or the background can help you maybe have a hand in policy. But did you guys, or anybody can answer this, I suppose, feel that having a hand in policy or engagement helped your science as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think definitely so, in a couple of different ways. One, a lot of my research was federally funded. And so being able to understand kind of what does policymakers care about when you're kind of writing reports or kind of thinking about from that perspective, it's great to have that knowledge to then kind of think about, okay, you're in the weeds on some particular research area, but it can be much more broadly applied to different things. I think doing policy, and also as I think Adriana mentioned, was her job is a lot of writing. Policy is a lot of communication. So doing policy has made me a much better communicator about my science, even speaking to other scientists who aren't, chemists that specialize in nanomaterials, which is what I did. Right, so being able to speak about that to other scientists even, it improves your communication skills a lot. And I think that's a valuable skill for all scientists and engineers should develop.
Yeah, and I'll sort of also add to that. I mean, one, I wouldn't underestimate the value of the sort of communicating with a lot of different audiences, because particularly as you progress in your career, even if you sort of remain in kind of an academic research career, the expectations that you do that get broader, whether that's with your dean or funders or what have you. But I'll share that since I work in the private sector, now I have sort of a very broad portfolio of technologies that I work with, I mean, all in the AI space, but still, and I work with a lot of partners. I work with a lot, I oversee a lot of different engineers internal to my company, a lot of different customers with different applications. I would say like there's probably not a day goes by where something that like has come out of some element of my policy engagement doesn't in some direct way inform something that I do. Either I know something through policy engagement that I wouldn't have known otherwise, or it's just, some skill that I developed through having to work with a lot of different stakeholders, build consensus. So, there's sort of these indirect things, but there's also just a lot of direct exposure that you get, I think, through policy engagement, maybe seeing the impact of work that you do, or maybe kind of adjacent knowledge to whatever your area of expertise is. So it may not be obvious when you're kind of still taking courses and studying for exams, but I think it does become obvious over time.
I'm thinking I can add here. So as I said in the talk, I think it does give you a broader view of your research field when you're thinking about what else it can impact and how that really has a role in the community. But also for my role, and I guess to kind of put a plug for government relations folks, because our job is essentially to connect between researchers and policymakers, and working for a university, that's sort of what we do. And we engage, UC students in advocacy and train them and all of that. So that's something, if you haven't thought about, look at your government relations office that may be able to help connect you also.
It's a great point. And we actually had someone from our A&M government relations office on a few webinars past. So if you watch those webinars and wanted to get involved, I'm sure they'd be happy to chat. I guess another question, both Chris and Arti, you guys mentioned this when you're talking about engaging locally, right? Finding an issue that you're passionate about or something that you're interested in, right? What's the best way, I suppose, to sort of maybe identify some of those people? Is it just through things like articles and things that are published? Is there a good or a bad way to go about approaching them or the situation or, that kind of stuff, right? I mean, networking is so hard. I feel like when you haven't really put yourself up into that space yet. So it's, any tips you guys have might be interesting to hear.
I think the sort of showing up is often the really great first step. And, the point is, and that, I think that quote from Louis Abramson, I really like it because it's a little nerve-wracking to show up the first time. But the nice thing I think about sort of either local government meetings or kind of community organization meetings is you often can just show up and sit in the back room. And, you don't have to do much more than that. Actually, one of the first articles we published with ESAL was somebody who serves in the state legislature for the state of Washington. And he's a data scientist, he's a Ph.D. statistician. And, he shared this story where he just kind of wanted to get more involved and engaged. So I think, he was living in Seattle and he showed up at a committee meeting that sounded interesting to him. And he just showed up, sat in the back, and he said everybody introduced himself to him. He didn't have to say anything. This is the first time a member of the public had ever showed up at the meeting. And, that obviously sort of inspired him to continue getting more engaged. And so, I mean, I think that it's actually not very intimidating because what ends up happening is that people are just really excited that you want to be there. I mean, somehow through some of the work that I've done with the city, it's kind of come to be known that I care about issues of housing insecurity and food insecurity. So I just get invited to random county level meetings with the food bank, and everybody's just excited that someone with some technical skills showed up. So I think that first barrier of showing up can be a little scary, but after that it becomes a lot easier.
I think that's a great answer and a great point. I think, that makes a big difference, right? Just being able to sort of see people over and over again and kind of have those conversations. I have, I guess, one more last tips question or anything, right? A lot of people, we talk about communication, and I think at least from a graduate perspective, you do get a lot of experience in maybe some of the writing and some of the more technical styles of presenting, but policy has like its own entire language, right? And advocacy as well, sort of a lot of that, like legislative language. We were talking about writing initiatives or things like that for government, locally or federally. And just engaging with people, right? The sort of lingo is very different. So do you guys have any suggestions for ways you can improve that skill or get exposure to those skills if you don't necessarily have a direct connection to working on some legislative documents or things like that? Is it just sort of reading? Is it just being more engaged? Any sort of information on that end?
I can start off by saying just do it. For me as a graduate student, like nobody ever taught me how to write policy. And I don't think it's very rarely ever taught formally, at least not in the context that policy is actually used, right? So I think just getting started and doing it and getting some practice. Again, if there's an issue that you cared about, so I can take electric vehicles as a particular issue that I focused on for a while. I actually wrote a more formal memo for JSPG actually, that was published on this issue. And then I took that and then I made it into a one-pager. So much more condensed, a little bit more digestible format that I could give to people. You might then translate that into write your 3-minute public comment. So you can do it without necessarily having to develop a ton of expertise, but you can kind of just practice. Here are all the different formats and ways in which I can present an issue and in a way that different audiences understand, and you will develop expertise kind of in any given topic if you just write about it and just do it. But also kind of understanding the ways in which you can frame an issue to be more or less effective and frame it for different audiences, I think is a really valuable skill.
Adriana, I don't know if you're going to jump in, but, there are also a lot of the organizations, JSPG, some of the other partner organizations that we work with, we've hosted policy memo writing workshops, and, JSPG, I think, has run, kind of been the driver behind a lot of these, and op-ed writing, because op-ed writing, especially in local papers, can be a fairly impactful way, potentially, of kind of getting conversations started around policy questions. So I think there are also resources out there, one-pager, kind of how to write a one-pager as well. I know the AGU used to publish something on this, and I think we used to have it linked on our website. Maybe we can look for that. So there are also a lot of resources out there. I think the trickiest one is drafting legislation. When I was a congressional fellow, I did draft legislation, and there can be some nuances. And I think also it might depend a little bit on the legislative body, where some of those nuances come into play, and kind of the bulk of legal interpretive work that's happened over the years, how the difference between should and shall is like a big one that I came to appreciate working on the Hill. So I think that's often the trickiest one. But I will say this, is that I think and scientists and engineers were maybe a little bit more attuned to precision in the use of language. And so that's where I think, so the actual structure of legislation is just weird. I mean, you can learn the pattern by looking at it, but it is what it is. But I think that we can sometimes be a little bit more attuned to some of those nuances in how a sentence might be structured, and that would have impact on the meaning.
Yeah, I think, I agree with the legislative writing. I think if you are in an organization that would do that, or in a fellowship, I know Kristen talked about that, but, I think a lot of these fellowships, you might get to do that, or if you're not in a sort of longer term job. So for sort of learning this, since you brought this up now, I'll have to do a little plug here for our events. So JSPG, we organize writing workshops for policy papers, sort of where you get hands-on experience to write an outline for the paper for different issues. We do webinars, kind of discussions on different topics, so you can learn about kind of the latest topics. But I think this is also a plug for, if anyone here is from a, university or thinking about kind of training, we do need more training in science policy and in universities just across the board. I think these things are coming from outside, from JSPG, NSPN, different groups that do organize trainings. But I think, we'd be better off if there were more kind of university training on this. So anyway, that's something to for you all to think about, because we do need more of that. But JSPG is one of the resources you can come to.
Awesome. Yeah, I would love if there was more university trainings, right? Make it a little bit more accessible to students because you get all those flood of information anyways. All right, well, I think we're pretty much up at time, right at 5:30 perfectly. So I don't want to keep you guys too late. And I wanted to just say thank you for coming. A lot of the communications toolkits and things that were just mentioned, we will probably have a webinar on in about a month. So if you're signed up, good for you. So you'll get a little bit of background on that, but I just wanted to say thank you to all of our speakers and to all of the people that have attended. And thank you very much for coming. And I hope you have a great week.